he's avoiding yet another huge hole in the cheese, Fred. And that's the fact that carbon-14 is everywhere. It's everywhere it shouldn't be. It's found in diamonds mined from deep beneath the Earth's surface. It's found in dinosaur bones. It's found in oil and coal. All these things that should be millions of years old have all this carbon-14.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, science geek, amateur comedian. Fred, it's great to be back with you talking about real science on Friday.
Last week we began counter-debunking Professor Dave's The Definitive Guide to Debunking Creationists Part 1, Cosmology, Planetary Science. So he started these series of videos that he claims debunks creationists. So this YouTube personality claims to have debunked all these various creationist talking points, and yet halfway through his first video that we covered last week, we only got halfway through, he had not yet listed a single legitimate creationist talking point. We ended the show with a teaser that we had finally reached a point in Professor Dave's Part 1 video where he finally mentions an actual creationist talking point.
That's right. And we're going to get to that, but I think you just coined a term, counter-debunking. That's almost like anti-disestablishmentarianism, almost. Counter-debunking.
I like it.
Because you'd be bunking or debunking, but we're counter-debunking. That's pretty sophisticated stuff, I'll tell you what. But before we get started, Fred, now, we're going to get to a legitimate Christian creationist talking point that Dave managed to stumble backwards over after, half a dozen videos or so. But I want to remind the audience what they can expect when we go through David James' videos. I liked your analogy of evolution, the whole evolutionary theory as Swiss cheese with great big holes in it. In fact, you should run that animation so people can know what I'm talking about.
Okay, I'm starting it right now.
All right. So from what we've already seen, the pretender, in just the first half of his videos, he's allegedly debunked creationist talking points, and he's navigated through the failed theory of evolution by resorting to several straw man arguments, referencing talking points used by evolutionists. He's used plenty of hyperbole. He's engaged in elaborate storytelling and avoided the big holes in the cheese, trying to prevent his audience from seeing the elephant in the room that often falsifies his theory.
Yep. He avoids the biggest holes of all. He just navigates around them, and there's so many of them. Why isn't he telling his audience about these really big problems with the theory? And many times these are problems that outright falsify his theory. So, we finally get to a legitimate talking point, Doug.
Yes.
And let's see if he debunked it. So let's go ahead and roll the tape.
Creationist claims regarding problems with Big Bang cosmology are typically just lies about what we can or should observe. For example, the first stars that formed are now called population 3 stars, which were predominantly short-lived, and whose supernova remnants collected to form population 2 and then in turn population 1 stars. They can be differentiated by their metallicity, or the proportion of elements other than hydrogen and helium that they contain. They will say something like, "Where are all the population 3 stars? Why can't we see them anywhere?" Of course, the model proposes that they are predominantly long gone, so they should, for the most part, only be detectable in galaxies that are so far away that the light we receive from them was emitted in a time when population 3 stars were still around and dominated their galactic landscape. In fact, recent observational evidence for population 3 stars has been collected in distant quasars. It's simply very difficult to collect such data and has only been possible rather recently with the most sophisticated space-based telescopes.
He says that they've found population 3 stars with the latest space-based telescopes.
Right.
But Doug, when I did even just a cursory research of this claim, you find that it's really speculative, and there's, tons of data that's missing. Now, one of my favorite magazines I mentioned on the show before, my favorite secular magazines, my favorite science magazines are definitely the ones put out by Creation Research Society, Creation Ministries International, Answers in Genesis' Answers magazine. Those are all fantastic. So this one's Quantum Magazine, which I enjoy from a secular perspective. And there's a physicist, Mike Norman, and he said, if the helium-2 results stand up to scrutiny, one possibility is a cluster of population 3 stars. However, he goes on to say he's unsure if population 3 stars and later stars could mix together so readily. So, and there's another guy, the article mentions Daniel Whalen. He's an astrophysicist at the University of Portsmouth, and he was similarly cautious and said it's not clean evidence because other piping hot cosmic objects can produce a similar helium-2 signature.
Uh-huh.
So the Prof. Dave that I think you're referring to him as David James.
David
I
James,
think that's what you think is, yeah, that's what his mom would probably call him when she's mad at him.
Well, when she catches him in a lie. Yeah.
There you go. So he's exaggerating. Here's a case where he takes a creationist talking point, and he doesn't have strong evidence to stand on. They're kind of grasping at the stars to find this evidence. So,
well,
this is
David James' mom always told him, Davey, reach for the stars. but Fred, I will say, he did say that the data was hard to collect. So he left himself enough wiggle room to not just be flatly wrong, but he certainly can't get away with calling that debunking anything.
Exactly.
No way.
And let's not forget, this is the very first talking point that creationists have actually made that he's now trying to debunk. Because the last show, if you go back and watch it, they were either straw man arguments, claims that not made by, creationists who are informed, or they were claims made by evolutionists. If you remember, that book I have, Rare Earth, these guys they're not evolutionists. These guys are not creationists.
Right.
And he's debunked the fine-tuning argument. Hey, you're debunking your own guys, and you didn't debunk it.
No,
so,
I think that's bunking, as a matter of fact. All right, now let's watch the next video where he's going to address the speed of light. Oh, this is one of my favorite topics.
These objects are very far away, often millions of light years, so for their light to have reached our eyes, they must have existed for at least that many years. To combat this, young Earth creationists will say things like, the speed of light must have changed over time, having once been much faster to make up for the large distances. This is, of course, totally unfounded, not only without empirical basis, but also in direct violation of special relativity, which is very well substantiated.
Okay, several problems here, Fred. Now, first, we didn't mention earlier that there's a problem with the CMB for evolutionists. The problem is the CMB being roughly the same temperature everywhere. That's a serious problem for evolutionists. That's called the horizon problem. That's another hole in the cheese. We haven't even gotten to that.
Yeah. So we're talking about the cosmic background radiation in last week's show. We talked, we went through that, but we didn't mention the horizon problem. The universe has this background radiation that they've detected. The problem is, it's pretty much the same everywhere, except for that one little problem they have called the axis of evil. But in general, it's fairly homogeneous, okay? And how did it get there in 13 billion years? It can't, because the amount of time it takes for light to travel across the universe, you would maybe get this far. Imagine a really huge room, and maybe you get this far with the speed of light. So they have that problem. They have their own speed of light problem. They can't get the universe homogeneous as it is with the current speed of light. So they came up with the inflation theory, which has all kinds of problems. It should not be called a theory. It's a low-grade hypothesis.
Yes. Well, thank you, Fred, for clarifying, connecting the speed of light with the horizon problem. I don't think I was all that clear on that. That's why you're here to clarify things for people. And so, but let's talk about the speed of light, because what he just said about things being well established, wait a second here.
Exactly, Doug. So we have over 100 years of speed of light measurements that showed it slowed down. And this was eloquently described by a guy named Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, and he's hardly a creationist. He's worked as a biochemist at Cambridge University. He's a Harvard scholar. and a researcher at the Royal Society. So we are linking to his now banned TED Talk that you can easily watch elsewhere on YouTube. And it was called The Science Delusion. I'd highly recommend people to watch this video. And he really shows how, over time, what happened is they had this problem with the speed of light slowing down. And so what a standards committee did with the speed of light is they tied it to the meter. So by doing that, you can never, ever again tell if the speed of light is changing, if it's slowing down, because you've tied it to the meter, the thing that measures it. So if the meter gets a little bit bigger, you wouldn't know that the speed of light changed. So It was a little sleight of hand they pulled. And we would also, we'd like to refer our viewers to our show on plasma cosmology and zero-point energy, because if you had less zero-point energy at the time of creation, then light could travel faster because it's not impeded. And we know that light will slow down in things like glass, water. So there is evidence that the speed of light did slow, and it slows through certain mediums. So I doubt that Professor Dave has actually truly addressed this problem with the speed of light. It is an interesting topic. There's still a lot to learn. And Doug, we plan to do a show on special relativity, hopefully in the not too distant future. Yeah, it's going to be a fun topic, and a lot of it ties to that because, of course, he makes the claim that special relativity is solidly proven. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe that, including creationists. So we will tackle that subject on a future show.
Yes, and I'm certain that Professor Dave, I'm sure he knows that the speed of light slows down through glass and through water, and I'm certain that he's well qualified to address such topics. And but his well-substantiated assertion about special relativity, that's just another example of his professorial sleight of hand. Well, he's not even a professor, so his showman's sleight of hand. You know, because there are plenty of problems with Einstein's theory. And like you say, Fred, we plan to do a show on that in the future. But let's move on. Let's now jump into... This is actually a genuine Christian creationist talking point, the age of the Earth.
Continuing on to planetary science, we can make similar remarks about the age of the Earth. The accepted value of 4.54 billion years plus or minus 50 million years is well substantiated by geology, namely radiometric dating of zircon crystals and also carbonaceous chondrite meteorites.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Okay. Actually, as it turns out, he didn't even really mention a true creationist talking point on this, because I'm going to list one for him. He mentions zircons, but he doesn't want to tell his audience of a huge, gigantic elephant in the room, which is the fact that those zircons have helium in them. Now, this Professor Dave, he's pretty well versed on the creationist arguments. You can tell that by watching his videos. I've watched so far, his first 3 installments. So he knows a lot of our arguments, and I have a feeling he knows this one. He just doesn't want to talk about it because the evidence is overwhelming. And what it is a helium is it's a light, noble gas. It's very slippery. The problem is we find helium in those zircons. The helium should have diffused out of the zircons millions and millions of years ago. Yeah. So one of our very own Dr. Russ Humphreys, years ago, he set up an experiment with an independent lab, a lab that was not aware of the creationist implications. And it confirmed their slippery rate, the slip rate, or the diffusion through the zircons, and found that the zircons were roughly, get this, Doug, 6,000 years old. That was how old they could be. We're showing a graph of what this experiment showed from Dr. Russ Humphreys and an independent lab. It's one of the great examples of creation science that argues against an old Earth, that more and more people need to know about this kind of stuff. And this is just one example of many that we have that causes problems for an old Earth. Well, again, Dave's going through the evolutionary storytelling. He's navigating through the cheese, and he comes to this big hole that I suspect he knows about, and he avoids it and acts like they've got this overwhelming, staggering evidence for evolution in the age of the Earth. So
Yes. Yeah, he's like P.T. Barnum. This way to the egress. Right, and he gets away with it, and I love how the confidence with which he states the age of the Earth at 4.54 billion years, plus or minus 50 million years. throws that in there just because nobody can check that. It just makes him seem like he has more data. And I don't know, Fred.
It's the illusion of precision. 4.54. And then they contradict themselves by saying plus or minus 50 million years.
Right.
They should say plus or minus 50.567 million years.
Right. And
it's like a total contradiction.
If you were being honest, you would leave off the last 4. Because then you can't say you're not sure about the last 4, but then include that last digit. That's not fair. You're not allowed to get away with that. Anyway, Fred, I think he keeps that fudge factor in there so that it can be added later if necessary, or taken away later when actual data contradicts whatever their theory is and whatever they've constructed, and one of the cards falls out. They've always got this 50 million they can stick in there. And Fred, those helium atoms, they should have escaped that giant hole in the cheese, right? They should all be gone. And folks can check that out, by the way. RSR, I believe it's rsr.org/zircons, if you want to know more.
Yeah, we should find out if Swiss cheese has helium in it.
We have to have Dr. Humphreys send that to an independent lab. Check that out for us. All right, now let's go to the next creationist point that David James addresses, and let's see if he can debunk it. It's the constant decay rate.
Creationist responses to such data are typically denial and more ad hoc reasoning. They will say that decay rates have changed over time. This is totally baseless. Decay rates are based on the inherent stability of nuclides, which have nothing whatsoever to do with any kind of external environmental conditions. Nuclides decay at precisely the same rate in a vacuum as they do under any set of external stimuli.
Okay. So anyway, Fred, I can't let that go by without noting the extra words. Decay rates have nothing at all to do with anything at all to do with anything related to external. Just too many words there. I'm not sure. And how can you say that it's not affected by any external? I mean, how do you know that? That's just so ridiculous to state it like that. We need to get in Walt Brown's book on radioactivity, right? There's documented evidence for examples of electrical mechanisms that speed up radioactive decay like a billionfold.
Yeah. And, while that was running, I'd looked up a page on Real Science Radio. So Bob and I did a show on the origin of Earth's radioactivity back in August 21st, 2020. I remember that show was a lot of fun. So guess where you can find that, Doug? rsr.org/
radioactivity.
Exactly. That's what's great about what Bob did. He's got all these easy ways to find stuff on on our website, rsr.org. If you're thinking of a topic, radioactivity, well, let me just try /radioactivity. 90% of the time that's going to work. And if it doesn't, then you can just put it in the search on the website. So anyways, we did a really fun show on that. We're referencing a link to that page. And radioactivity came from the results, the impact of a global flood. We did not have radioactivity before the flood because radioactivity is harmful. And, it definitely wasn't in the creation event because after God finished creating, everything was very good. There's no way you'd have radioactivity that causes birth defects. I mean, right now, you and I are being bombarded with some radioactivity, and our bodies are decaying, and over time, we're going to, our lives are going to cease on this earth, and then, thank That's Jesus, right. We'll be with him for all eternity. So,
Amen.
Doug, again, I'll reference that page. And also, here's a quote from an evolutionist physicist. So this isn't a talking point from creationists. So again, Prof. Dave is not telling you about what their own evolutionist says. So this is a guy named Frederick B. Juneman, and this comes from the Industrial Research and Development. And here's what he said. There has been in recent years the horrible realization that radio decay rates are not as constant as previously thought, nor are they immune to environmental influences. And this could mean that the atomic clocks are reset during some global disaster. And events which brought about the Mesozoic to a close may not be 65 million years ago, but rather within the age and memory of man.
Oh!
What say you, Prof. Dave?
Well, and wait a second now. This isn't new, like breaking news. This is 1982. This might be before David James was born, young man. It might be.
It could be, actually. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right? So it's not like, and that's a flat contradiction in a peer-reviewed journal that's published that David James just ignores. That's a big hole that he just navigated around there.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And then using hyperbole, too, that, the constant decay, nothing will influence them. They're a constant. He's totally
Nothing at
wrong
all
about
to
that.
do with anything at all to do with anything to do with this. Right. Uh-huh.
Yep.
All right. Now, what do we got up next, Fred? Oh, this is a big one. One of the biggest, carbon-14.
Some pretend that carbon dating is the only form of radiometric dating, and since such dating methods are only reliable up to around 10 half-lives, carbon dating should only be used for objects under 50,000 years old or so, given that carbon-14 has a half-life of around 5,730 years. And that's correct, which is why we only use carbon dating within that range, typically for archaeological remains. They are oblivious to the fact that, once again, many different radioactive nuclides can be used, with wildly different half-lives, including uranium, which is one of the main ones used for the age of the Earth or other very old things. So when they ask how carbon dating can be used to determine the age of the Earth, you can simply say that it absolutely isn't, and why would they think that it was?
So here's another case where he acts like this is a creationist talking point, which it isn't, and so he's debunking a straw man.
Exactly, Doug. And as I've mentioned before, the left has real trouble avoiding their constant state of hypocrisy. So, Professor David James, I'd like to make you a bet. If I'm right, you simply pay me $100. I'm going to give you really good odds here. So, if I'm wrong, I'll pay you $5,000. So, Dave, I'll let you do the math on what the odds are on that. So,
hey, he's a professor. He can do that math.
Yeah. So let's go to a college campus. Let's say Colorado State University here in Colorado. And for those who go to the public school, Colorado State is in Colorado. For the University of Colorado at Boulder, let's go somewhere like that and randomly ask students how we know the age of the Earth. And I submit, far more often than not, they will mention carbon dating and not radiometric dating. I hear this all the time from laypersons on both sides, from both creationists and evolutionists, or I should say Christians and evolutionists, because, a lot of Christians are not versed on creation science, and we're trying to eradicate that because we think it's important to be able to always give a defense for the hope that lies within you, and having a knowledge of creation is a good thing to have. So the point is, laypersons will almost always say carbon dating, and yet you act like it's only the creationists that do that, only the Christians. That's totally not true, and I can prove you wrong. If you're willing to take that bet, Dave, you get $5,000 if you're right. If I'm right, you just have to slip over a C note to me. Are you willing to take that bet, Professor Dave? Oh, you're not? I didn't think so.
And that's because starting around 5th grade, at least if you go back to when I was in the public schools, the implication was that radiocarbon dating was the reason we knew the age of the Earth, the age of everything. And perhaps I'm willing to give them the idea that radiocarbon dating is just a shorthand for all radiometric dating. We do that with language. We use one term to describe an array of things. So I'm willing to give them that. But he's implying that we know that we're saying radiocarbon. But so he's attributing to Christian creation as something that's not true. It may just be a secular cultural shorthand, but it's not that we are saying it's only radiocarbon dating. And one of the things he's right about, Fred, is the very short half-life of carbon-14. Well, relatively short. So it's a lot longer than my life, but it's relatively short when you look at his 4.54 billion year, plus or minus 50 million year time frame. It's relatively short, where you shouldn't find much, if any, carbon-14 if the item is 50,000 years old or older. So without telling his audience He's avoiding yet another huge hole in the cheese, Fred. And that's the fact that carbon-14 is everywhere. It's everywhere it shouldn't be. It's found in diamonds mined from deep beneath the Earth's surface. It's found in dinosaur bones. It's found in oil and coal. All these things that should be millions of years old have all this carbon-14.
And they try to blame it on contamination, but how many things can get contaminated over time? I mean, you know, we mine diamonds from hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, and they always have carbon-14 in it. And you can be as careful as possible, and you're still going to find carbon atoms. With carbon's half-life of roughly 5,700 years, the carbon atoms should be all gone. Usually after 50,000 years, you're lucky to find one or two. So they shouldn't be there if these items are millions of years old, but they should be there if there was a global flood and you have this radioactive carbon decaying and you have it buried all around the globe everywhere. And just like you mentioned, in coal, oil, all these things that a lot of it are remnants of the global flood. And we find carbon-14 just as we'd expect, and we find helium in zircons. Uh-huh. We'll find out later if we find helium in Swiss cheese.
Oh, and Fred, here's one last clip from part 1 of David James' series, and it's actually a video we agree with on cherry picking.
Cherry picking has no place in science.
So the part we agree with, Fred, turns out to be less than 2 seconds long.
Yeah. Yeah, so we can't agree more with Professor Dave. And, you know, we'll leave it up to the audience watching this video, and hopefully we're getting people that watch his videos over here to see who's really cherry-picking the data. So,
Yeah, and by the way, Fred, I can't let this moment pass without addressing the screaming child graphic that is ubiquitous throughout Professor Dave's videos. So, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Dave is implying that the screaming child with the fists in the air and the squinted, scrunched eyes, obviously in a rage, I think he's implying that that's us. I think. But he may not realize that the opposite implication comes across. That's him. He's got his fists in the air and his eyes clenched and his ears closed so that he doesn't have to see and so that he doesn't have to hear all the evidence against old Earth, Big Bang cosmology, evolution, and his entire worldview. Yeah, and that's the way it comes across to me anyway.
Yeah, and that's often the case. They've got their fingers in their ears, la 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 la, you know.
Triple stamp a double stamp. You can't triple stamp a double stamp, Lord. You can't.
They don't want to hear the truth. And so you're right. That's really ironic that he would show that, because that's what we get from their side. And we get that in his videos. We're already through the first video of his. He's avoided all of the big holes in the cheese. And has he really debunked any creationist talking points? He only got to a handful of them. Most of his arguments were straw men. So, Doug, and by the way, Doug, we're almost out of time, but we haven't done our interesting fact of the week.
Oh, the interesting fact of the week. I'm sure everyone's been on the edge of their seat through the whole show. We better get to it.
All right. So, which internet hack uses a false moniker to promote fake science, often using straw men, hyperbole, and fairy tales to dupe his audience?
Okay, so I was going to say Kenny Rogers, Reuben James, but instead I'm going to say Professor David James.
Okay, so I'm going to actually give you a real interesting fact of the week. So I wanted to see if, I wanted to just test to see if you were paying attention to these shows. Okay, so here we go. The actual interesting fact of the week. What is the second most abundant element in the universe?
All right, so of course I would know the most abundant, never suspecting that the left cross was coming. After the stick and the jab, here comes the left cross with the second.
Because you got the first one right on the last show. The most abundant element is is hydrogen.
Hydrogen, yeah, but I
Yep.
never even saw this one coming. So the second would be nitrogen.
So remember the ratio we talked about the last show?
Oh, yeah. Duh.
And as it turns out, so helium, and then as it turns out, the third most is oxygen, and then the fourth is carbon, and the fifth, which was interesting, and we kind of talked about this during our interview with Dr. Gerald Pollack on water, which was a great show, by the way. Encourage our listening audience to go back and listen to that. And that's neon. Neon is the fifth most abundant element in the universe. So
Pretty
there
cool.
you have it.
And it's the second most abundant element in strip malls.
What's the most abundant?
Argon.
Argon.
Anyway,
Okay.
Fred, I used to work in a neon sign shop way back when I used to work with my
interesting.
hands.
Okay.
And so we made a living for many years installing neon. And by the way, neon signs are both neon and argon. So,
Okay.
yeah, most people don't know that. They just say neon. Hey, Fred, that's kind of like...
I thought the most abundant in a shopping mall would be females.
That's good. But you know, Fred, that because I know we're almost out of time. But so people say neon signs because they don't know that argon's involved. So nobody says argon signs. And we had mentioned earlier radiocarbon dating. People say radiocarbon dating. They don't say radiometric dating. But again, it's not our fault. It's not creationists that are specifically pointing out radio. Anyway, just wanted to drive that point home for David James, just in case he didn't think Mom caught that. She caught that one too. All right.
Yep. So we're pretty much out of time for this show, Doug, and we still have to get to part 2 of his video series where he claims to debunk creationist talking points on abiogenesis. Wow,
Okay.
that'll be interesting.
Hey, Fred, before we go, we do have a big announcement. One of the Real Science Radio family, one of our occasional co-hosts, got married recently.
Yeah, got married earlier this month, and we forgot to mention it the last show. So my son, Ryan Williams, has married Haley Guyette. They now go by Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Williams. How do I say that? Mr. and Mrs. Ryan and Haley Williams. There's no hyphenations. It's just she's now Haley Williams. I have a new daughter-in-law.
Yes.
And it was a great wedding. It was a lot of fun, and real excited about that. So,
hey, that's awesome, Fred. And Haley, of course, does not identify as a biological woman because she's a woman.
she's just a woman. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's a wife.
So,
And hopefully soon enough she'll be a mother, and then Fred will be grandpa. Man.
yep. Wilson. Yeah, that's. I know that she's very much looking forward to that. I'm not quite sure if Ryan's there yet, but you know. Yeah. So, anyways, yeah. Okay. Well, Doug, we're gonna hit the abiogenesis show next week. So, for Doug McBurney, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.